sorry, so that we can have it available to post for later use. So very, very briefly, my name is Amanda Margolis. For those of you who don't know me, I am the editor, the pharmacist editor for the Journal for the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us for our first Emerging Writers program. We'll go to the title page here. And this afternoon, we're going to talk about the publication process, authorship, and peer review. And I am joined by several of the other writing club advisors who might have some other things to add as well. So with that, I'm going to start with what is JPSW. JPSW stands for the Journal of the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin. It is a peer-reviewed, at this point, online journal for the most part. We publish a lot of evidence-based narrative reviews. We publish a lot of spotlights on pharmacists who are doing innovative things throughout the state. We do offer CEs, news from the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin. And I just want to point your attention to jpswi.org. This is the journal webpage, which I have up here. And you can see we post our current issues. We also post past issues and archives. So especially if you're writing an article and want some previous examples, you can take a look here, or feel free to email me and I can help set you up with that. But the other thing, if you're interested in writing for the journal, that I highly recommend is clicking on this for authors and reviewers, and it will take you to the author guidelines for manuscript preparation. And before you get too deep into your writing, I would recommend that you read through this. And we'll talk about some of these details as we go through this presentation. And I will also throw out that PSW is very much so inviting of trainee and new writers. And I think we've set up a program at this point in JPSW to really help learners start writing and to refine themselves and to have opportunities to publish, even for the sake of learning to write and improving on those skills, which is something that I really appreciate about the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin, allowing the journal to kind of take that approach, that it's informational for pharmacists, but it's also encouraging new writers. So what is our publication process? Well, the first thing after you've written the article and the subsequent emerging writers presentations will give you suggestions and tips on preparing that. The first thing once you're done is article submission. When you submit your article, it will come to one of our peer review coordinators. That might be me. If you're part of our student writing clubs, that might be your faculty advisor, or it might be another peer review coordinator that the journal, that volunteers for the journal. At that point, they will process it for peer review. And we're going to talk about this at a very high level at this point. Once it goes through peer review, you'll get suggestions on the content, if there's any details that the peer reviewer thinks should be added, or any little technical pieces. Then it gets sent back to you for revisions. Once it's all set, it goes back to that peer review coordinator and they decide if it's appropriate or not. Once it's accepted, it goes through an editorial review, which is more of a grammatical review. And then it gets put into the galley proof, where you review the PDF in the formatting that's going to be published. And then lastly, it gets published. And I have an example of a clip from a recent student writing club article here of what it might look like in the journal. So we're going to kind of walk through some of these pieces. The first is thinking about the article submission. And I mentioned before that we have criteria for the journal. The first is that for narrative reviews, which is what the student writing club focuses on, but also for primary literature, for say residents who are reviewing this series and thinking about writing up and publishing their residency projects, that's highly encouraged. An abstract is optional for JPSW at this time, but I do recommend it. I think it's a good practice to have an abstract, and I think it really helps the readership to decide if they want to dig deeper into that article. We do have a maximum of 5,000 words for any given manuscript that comes into JPSW. The exception to that is CE articles, and if you're interested in writing a CE, we can certainly talk, but that has a higher word limit because of some of the requirements related to the CE article. The word count includes everything. So it includes tables, figures, references. Student writing club articles, narrative reviews tend to be a little bit on the shorter side, but this is certainly not hard and fast. If there's a lot of information on your topic that you're ready to share and want to share, we're going to encourage you. If you are 5,001 words long and that's what it takes to get your ideas out, that is okay. We are not that strict on some of the formatting things like some other national journals might be. We have a little bit more flexibility being a smaller journal. We do use AMA, the American Medical Association reference formatting, and we will have a presentation later this fall specific to AMA formatting for JPSW. I am going to show you though, as you're working through it, you can see that the abstract is described here, the text, the number of words included, and then it gets into references, some additional guidance on AMA, on quoting and paraphrasing, that's open access. But then it also describes how to do references within the text, and then the information with examples that we expect for JPSW. So please look at that as you're preparing that part of your manuscript. For tables and figures, what I want to say here is that if you are reproducing a figure from another source, which can sometimes be very appropriate, if it's something that's been published somewhere else, you do need permission to reprint that in another venue, such as JPSW. Same with tables. If the table is too similar to the source material, you may need permission to reprint. And we have a note here on from a published source, you need to have permission to reprint first. And we'll talk about that later in this fall as well. The other thing I'll note with both tables and figures, as I've mentioned here, oh, nope, I didn't mention it there, I apologize, is that when you use like acronyms within a table or figure, you need to put the definition for that acronym within the footnotes, even if it's already defined within the paper, because a table or figure should be able to stand alone and be read by an author. And then the last little tip that I've pulled out of the journal criteria, and again, I would encourage you to review the journal criteria in full, but the last little tip is that drug names should be in generic unless it's very pertinent to have different brand names that are pertinent to the discussion, or it's within the table for clarity and completeness. For instance, my students are working on an article related to biosimilars. I could see them needing to include some brand names to really flesh out that discussion. Okay, a little bit more on the peer review process. Now, this is a peer review process. This figure here is really focusing on primary literature, but it's the same process we use for secondary literature for our narrative reviews. And this is also the same process we use for primary literature. So if someone submits a case report, or they submit a report from a residency project or a new program at a pharmacy, this is the same process we use regardless at JPSW. So the first is, we study something, and the studying might be, we are investigating previously published literature and synthesizing it for our readership. And so the authors write up their manuscript, the journal editor or peer review coordinator receives it. JPSW is, we attempt to be double blinded, meaning we remove both the author names and information, and we also remove the peer reviewer's identity from the feedback that goes back to the author. So we review it. Being part of the student writing club, when you work with your advisors, you may receive comments back. I wouldn't say that, it may be rejected. We're not going to automatically reject you. We will work with you to get the article to the quality that we expect for JPSW. So you might get feedback, you might get revisions before we actually send it out to independent peer reviewers. At that point, we send it out to 2 to 3 independent peer reviewers. We try to pick individuals outside of the same hospital system. So I practice at the Madison VA. If one of my colleagues sent me an article for publication, I would make sure to send it maybe to the Milwaukee VA or UW Health or Freighter or other places other than that Madison VA, even if they have other people who'd be great peer reviewers, just to help the blinding and the anonymity of the review, and to make sure it makes sense to a reviewer that's not familiar with that system. So those peer reviewers will give feedback, and they will give it back to the editor, and then we will blind it and we will send it back to the authors. At that point, the thing that I want to emphasize here is that as the author, you will probably have some revisions to make, and we will have a whole session also on the peer review process, how to digest that peer review feedback, maybe how you would conduct a peer review, what you would look for. But the things to take away here that I want to stress is, you're hopefully going to get 2 to 3 sets of feedback in your peer review. And what I would encourage you to do is to look across those. If you have consistent feedback from a reviewer that something is wrong or something needs to be clarified, that means it's not clear to the readership and should be revised. Now, that being said, I also have had peer review feedback where they're asking for information that's way outside the scope of the article. And so at that point, we say, we're not going to change that in the manuscript. That's not what we're trying to achieve here. And that's okay too, to kind of justify or explain why you chose not to include that. Once those revisions are made and the editor or peer review coordinator in our case feels that it's acceptable, then we would go back and send it on to editorial review. We have a copy editor for JPSW, and then it goes to the galley proofing with our managing editor, and then we post it for publication, which is exciting. I wanted to give you a sense of the criteria that is used in the peer review process. Let's see. I will send out these slides so that you can have access to these links that I'm sharing. But what I've done is I've posted the peer review checklist, and we can make this link available so that you can see what kinds of things the peer reviewers will look for even as you're writing the manuscripts. You can think about, and I would encourage you that when you're writing, before you submit it, run through these to make sure that that at least from your perspective, you've achieved these items, that the title is related to the content, not overstating it. The content in the introduction is in a logical order and makes sense. So, but I'll make this available so you can kind of see what they're going to use in advance. The last little thing that I wanted to review is authorship. Who should be on the byline for a manuscript? This comes from the Association of Medical Editors, but it's a pretty standard set of authorship criteria. And where this can be especially important is if you're in a group and somebody does not meet these, to have that discussion with them. But it can go both ways. Maybe someone is contributing and you need to take a step back and say, hey, maybe this individual should be somewhere on the byline and should be included. And so, for instance, when my students in the student writing club write their manuscripts, sometimes the pharmacist mentor has participated pretty in depth to the point where authorship is appropriate and they are included on the byline as one of the authors. Sometimes they're in more of a facilitating role and they're not as involved in the manuscript. And in those cases, they might be included as an acknowledgement instead. So let's review the information. Authorship credit should be based on substantial contributions to the conception and design of acquisition of data or analysis or interpretation of data. So what does that mean this is clear for a piece of primary literature where it's the people who are helping to design the intervention or design the evaluation or collect the data, right? That makes sense. In a narrative review, did they help with the decisions for what's going to be included in that narrative review? Did they maybe help with the literature search? Did they help review that literature to contribute information into the manuscript? Those are the things you might consider when deciding if a potential author has met the first criteria. The second criteria for authorship is drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content. So this is important. When a co-author is reviewing an article, are they giving feedback on the content? Are they adjusting or elaborating on ideas within the manuscript? Versus, and this isn't a disservice to her, but compared to my copy editor who goes through it to make sure that it's grammatically correct, make sure that the punctuation is correct. She's not an expert in that intellectual content, and she's not editing it with that in mind. So she's not considered part of the authorship. She's considered part of the editorial team. Same for me when I'm reviewing an article from the editorial side. And then lastly, everyone who is an author needs to approve the final version of the article to be published. And this should happen before you submit it to the editor or the peer review coordinator, meaning your advisor if you're part of the student writing club. Authors do need to meet all three of these conditions. And again, if somebody contributes, but they don't meet all three conditions, then it's appropriate to consider more for the acknowledgement section. The last thing we're going to talk about is authorship order. So knowing who makes it into the byline is one thing, but then the order that they come in can also be important. As a student, I don't know that this is overly concerning. I think at the student looking for resident, looking for fellowship, looking for your first job, I think it's more important just to be on a published manuscript versus where in the order you are. But as you get further in your career, this might become very important, or especially if you go into academia, this can become very important. So the first authors, those are the people who are really drafting the article. Those are the people who are putting significant time into that manuscript. If you have many people, it might be the person who's kind of the team lead. It might be alphabetical if you feel like people are contributing equally. It might be some seniority based off of the year in school, but whatever it is, that should be agreed upon, hopefully, before you start writing the article. Other co-authors who maybe didn't contribute as significantly will come later in the byline. So, it might be Joe Smith, and then it might be John Doe, and then it might be Jane Johnson, so we're thinking about that order. The last author can be, it can go either way, it depends on the group. It can be the individual who contributed the least, but it might also be the senior author. So especially if I'm writing with students, sometimes I'm the last author to show that I was kind of the person guiding them at that level. And that kind of depends on what the article content is and the needs of the different individuals working on the manuscript as well. So that's the very quick and dirty on authorship order. If there's questions on any of this, the mentors for student writing clubs are certainly willing to talk to individuals about it. I'm also available to answer questions or kind of discuss this further for people who have questions. With that, I'll pause and I'll ask what questions you have. And we are also doing some evaluations on the presentations. So if you have a minute, I would request that you complete the Qualtrics survey, especially for students who are joining us. Thank you again. I would say peek at that if you don't mind and fill that out for the resident who's assisting with developing and overseeing the Emerging Writers Program. That would be very useful. So with that, what questions do you have, or other writing club advisors? What other pearls do you want to add to this discussion?
Margolis, it was awesome. Thank you for that basic primer for our student writers.
Yeah.
I think the one thing I would just add to it, and it probably is coming for or in the other later presentation, is the revised peer review process we will have. And I don't want to spill any beans, but as the mentor of writing clubs, we will be guiding students with that too.
Of course.
Thank you, Amanda, for that review. I think you highlighted some of the key things that I have seen really helpful for students to assure success later on in the writing process. So really being familiar with those author guidelines and what's expected is a great place to start. Making sure you have the appropriate sections and you have sort of outlined your article using that as a guideline, and then having those authorship discussions up front in terms of who comes first, and as you're sort of going through your topic and creating your outline, assigning who's doing what. That's a good time to think about, okay, is there somebody that's taking more of the brunt of this and really leading it, and is that the first author, and have those discussions so it's not awkward
Yes.
later on in the process.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions from our students here?
I do have a quick question. Will we have access to this or a list of some kind that we can use throughout the writing process?
Do you mean like the slides or?
Yeah, if that's okay. If not, I totally understand.
No.
Super helpful.
We are planning to take both the videos, the slides, some other resources, probably within the next week or so, I would expect, and to start building the Emerging Writers series as an open access page on the JPSW website. And once that's up, I'll distribute it to all of the peer review coordinators, or excuse me, too many hats that we all wear here. All of these student writing club advisors to distribute to their students as a resource. And, again, we're hoping that this program is for students, but also residents and other people who might consider writing for the journal. So all comers.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. I know a couple of us have a class that's about to start, so I do have to head off.
I get it. Yep.
Thank you. This was great.
Perfect. Well, with that, we'll let everyone go. Thank you for hopping on. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
See ya.